Within 24 hours of this war beginning, Iran's entire air defense network went dark across major parts of the country. And the weapon that actually made that possible wasn't some brand new secret piece of technology unveiled for the first time. It was years of quiet intelligence work using a completely different country's military hardware as a training ground to learn exactly how to blind a system Iran had spent billions of dollars building. Stick with me for the next 30 minutes because I'm going to walk you through exactly how Iran's air defenses actually collapsed this year. The surprising, almost unbelievable place Israel and the United States practiced defeating this exact system years before ever firing a shot at Iran, how thoroughly that network has now been dismantled, and why Iran's own desperate response to that collapse might end up being just as significant as the collapse itself. Let's start with what Iran's air defense system actually looked like before this war even began, because understanding its original design is essential to understanding exactly how it got dismantled so quickly. According to reporting from Middle East Monitor, prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Tehran's entire air defense architecture was widely viewed as rigid, vulnerable, and relatively easy to map. Iran relied heavily on expensive, centralized systems, most notably the Russian-made S-300 PMU-2 batteries, delivered back in 2016 under a contract worth roughly $1 billion, alongside indigenous Iranian platforms including the Bavar 373 and Corded 15 systems. Here's a detail that should immediately jump out at you. For a country spanning 1.6 million square kilometers, genuinely massive territory, Iran had deployed only 4 S-300 batteries. Think about the sheer scale mismatch there. 4 expensive centralized air defense batteries, trying to provide meaningful coverage across a country roughly the size of Alaska. That kind of thin, spread-out deployment inevitably leaves enormous surveillance gaps across huge stretches of territory. But the deeper vulnerability wasn't really about the number of batteries. It was about how those batteries actually worked. According to that same Middle East Monitor analysis, Iran's most significant structural weakness was its dependence on active, high-frequency radar emissions, the kind of signal that can be readily detected and targeted by Western electronic warfare systems. Here's an analogy that might help make sense of this. Imagine trying to hide in a dark room while holding a bright flashlight that you have to keep switched on continuously just to see anything happening around you. Anyone else in that room can simply look for the light itself to know exactly where you are, standing there the whole time. That's essentially the trade-off built into how the S-300 system operates. It needs to actively broadcast radar signals to detect and track incoming threats. But broadcasting those signals also reveals its own precise location to anyone with the right equipment to detect that specific radar signature. And here's where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, because Israel and its allies didn't just theoretically understand this vulnerability. According to Middle East Monitor's reporting, Israeli and American air forces had spent years actually studying the specific vulnerabilities of the S-300 system through tactical simulations involving similar systems operated by an entirely different country, Greece. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the more fascinating pieces of this entire story. Greece, a NATO member, and a country with no direct involvement whatsoever in the conflict between Israel and Iran, happens to operate its own S-300 air defense batteries, acquired years earlier for its own entirely separate reasons. And because that Greek-operated system uses essentially the same underlying technology as the batteries Iran had purchased from Russia, Israeli and American forces were able to use exercises involving Greece's own systems as a real practical proving ground, quietly learning exactly how to detect, track, and ultimately defeat this specific type of Russian-made air defense technology, years before ever actually needing to use that knowledge against Iran itself. That's the weapon this entire video's title is really pointing toward, and it's genuinely more interesting than any single missile or piece of hardware. The actual weapon that took down Iran's air defenses wasn't a specific bomb or a specific aircraft. It was years of patient, methodical intelligence preparation, using a completely unrelated country's identical hardware as a training simulator to build exactly the technical knowledge needed to blind and destroy this specific system the moment war actually began. Let's talk about how that carefully built knowledge actually translated into real combat results once this war started. According to that same reporting, coalition suppression campaigns in 2026 reportedly neutralized key targeting radars with relative ease, rendering some of Iran's most sophisticated missile batteries effectively blind. Think about what that word blind actually means in this specific context. An air defense battery that can't effectively track incoming threats isn't just weakened, it's essentially useless for its primary purpose, no matter how powerful its actual missiles might be. A missile system with no functioning radar to guide it is a little bit like having a perfectly good gun with no way to actually aim it. And this wasn't the first time Israel had specifically targeted this exact category of Iranian defense either. According to a detailed account of earlier Israeli strikes on Iran back in October of 2024, More than a year before this current war began, Israel conducted a dedicated strike campaign specifically targeting Iran's air defense network. According to American and Israeli officials at the time, that operation destroyed Iran's missile production capability and heavily damaged its air defense network, with officials specifically stating that all of Iran's long-range surface-to-air missile batteries and long-range detection radars were destroyed in that single campaign. Israeli officials at the time said that operation left most of Iran's air defense network, including nearly all of its advanced S-300 systems, destroyed, specifically paving the way for potential future Israeli strikes. In other words, this year's war wasn't the first time Israel had gone after Iran's air defenses. It was building directly on top of an already devastating campaign conducted more than a year earlier, one specifically designed to clear the path for exactly this kind of larger, more comprehensive military operation whenever it eventually came. 38A. Let's bring this forward to what actually happened once this current war began on February 28th. According to the Times of Israel, following Israel's opening decapitation strikes, which killed Iran's supreme leader and more than 40 top Iranian officials in a single devastating operation, the IDF reported achieving aerial superiority in parts of Iran within just 24 hours of the war starting. 24 hours. That's how quickly Israel was able to establish enough control over Iranian airspace to enable large-scale strikes in Tehran and other areas, with meaningfully lower risk to its own fighter jet pilots. That speed simply doesn't happen by accident. It's the direct practical payoff of years of prior intelligence work, including that earlier October 2024 campaign, and the broader pattern of studying and simulating exactly how to defeat this specific Russian-supplied technology. Let's put some real numbers on just how thoroughly this air defense network has actually been dismantled over the course of this war. According to the Jerusalem Post's detailed analysis of Operation Rising Lion and Operation Roaring Lion, Israel's 2 connected military campaigns against Iran, there have been 5 main challenging categories of Iranian air defense capability that Israel has worked systematically to destroy throughout both this current war and the earlier 12-day war back in June of 2025. The top category involves Iran's most advanced mobile anti-aircraft missile systems, essentially a dozen or more missiles clustered together on a single vehicle for mobility and flexibility. During the earlier 12-day war in 2025, Israel's Air Force destroyed about 50% of these mobile systems. By the time of this more recent, more extensive campaign, that figure had climbed to approximately 92% destroyed. Think about that jump for a moment, from roughly half destroyed to more than 90% destroyed across these 2 connected campaigns. That's not incremental degradation. That's the near total elimination of an entire category of Iran's most flexible, most survivable air defense assets. And this pattern of systematic destruction extends well beyond just those mobile systems specifically. According to the Times of Israel, citing Israeli military officials, the IDF had, by mid-March of this year, claimed to have destroyed or disabled around 70% of Iran's estimated 500 ballistic missile launchers. That same reporting noted something important, though, that it's believed to be relatively simple for Iran to actually build new launchers, exactly as it did following the earlier June 2025 war. That's a genuinely important caveat to include here, because it highlights a real limitation in how much permanent damage even this kind of devastating campaign can actually inflict. Destroying 70 or even 90% of a specific weapons category matters enormously in the short term. But if the underlying industrial capacity to rebuild those exact systems remains intact, that destruction risks becoming a temporary setback rather than a truly permanent transformation of the strategic balance. That's exactly why, according to that same Times of Israel reporting, the IDF's own strategic focus has been deliberately shifting over time, moving from the initial dramatic decapitation strikes and subsequent attacks on missile launchers and air defense systems toward a more focused effort specifically targeting Iran's underlying military industry itself. According to Israeli officials, this current war represents something meaningfully different and far more extensive than the earlier 12-day war specifically, because it's aimed not just at neutralizing Iran's existing military threat in the moment, but at eliminating what officials describe as Iran's broader strategic threat for the foreseeable future, by going after the actual industrial capacity that lets Iran continue rebuilding these systems in the first place. Let's bring in the Pentagon's own assessment of this broader campaign, too, because American officials have offered strikingly similar language about the scale of destruction involved. According to Defense Scoop's reporting from an April Pentagon press briefing, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, described the American-led effort, known as Operation Epic Fury, as having destroyed Iran's defense industrial base and its ability to reconstitute those capabilities for years to come. Kane specifically stated that American forces, working alongside partners, had attacked approximately 90% of Iran's weapons factories. 90% of an entire country's weapons manufacturing capacity, according to America's own top military officer, attacked over the course of this campaign. That's the kind of figure that, if accurate, genuinely does represent a fundamental, potentially long-lasting transformation in Iran's ability to sustain and rebuild its military capabilities, rather than simply a temporary tactical setback that gets quietly repaired once the immediate fighting settles down. Now, it's important to include Iran's own perspective and its own stated response to all of this destruction, because Tehran hasn't simply accepted this narrative of comprehensive collapse without pushing back. According to reporting from June, a senior Iranian commander, Brigadier General Amir Alireza Elhami, who leads Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya Joint Air Defense Headquarters, stated publicly that Iran would rapidly replace air defense systems and equipment damaged during what he described as the U.S.-Israeli aggression, specifically emphasizing the country's reliance on domestically developed military technology. He described Iran's entire air defense network as built entirely on indigenous capabilities, covering equipment, operational systems, tactics, command and control centers, communications infrastructure, and intelligence components. That's a striking claim to make in the immediate aftermath of a campaign that, according to both Israeli and American officials, destroyed the vast majority of exactly this kind of infrastructure. Whether Iran can genuinely rebuild this system as thoroughly and as quickly as this commander suggests remains a genuinely open question, one that will likely take months or years to fully answer, especially given the specific American claim that roughly 90% of the actual weapons factories needed to rebuild this capability have themselves already been destroyed. Let's talk about the genuinely fascinating twist buried inside this entire story, because it connects directly to a separate topic we've covered previously on this channel. According to that same Middle East Monitor analysis, the destruction of Iran's conventional centralized air defense network appears to have accelerated the development of an entirely different, considerably more resilient, and potentially more dangerous doctrine on Iran's part. Recognizing that it simply couldn't match Western air power in a conventional, centralized contest built around large, expensive, radar-dependent batteries, Iran appears to have shifted meaningfully toward a much more decentralized approach, one built around exactly the kind of shoulder-fired portable missile systems we discussed in an earlier video, the kind of weapon that reportedly brought down that American F-15E Strike Eagle back in April, along with multiple expensive American MQ-9 Reaper surveillance drones. Think about the strategic irony sitting right at the center of that shift. Israel and its allies spent years methodically studying and preparing to defeat Iran's centralized, radar-dependent S-300 system, using Greek military exercises as a training ground, and that preparation paid off enormously once this war actually began, achieving aerial superiority within 24 hours, and eventually destroying roughly 90% of Iran's mobile missile systems. But that very success appears to have pushed Iran toward developing and deploying an entirely different kind of threat, one built around cheap, portable, decentralized weapons that don't depend on the exact same vulnerable radar-emitting technology that made the S-300 system so susceptible to the specific intelligence and electronic warfare techniques Israel had spent years perfecting. That's genuinely worth sitting with, because it suggests this isn't simply a story about one side achieving total permanent air superiority over the other. It's a story about an extraordinarily sophisticated, years-long intelligence and electronic warfare campaign achieving genuine, dramatic success against one very specific category of threat, while simultaneously pushing the adversary toward developing a completely different kind of threat that requires an entirely new set of countermeasures to address effectively. Let's also touch on the broader regional impact of Iran's degraded air defense capability, because this doesn't just affect the direct fight between Iran and Israel. According to a detailed record of Iranian strikes on Jordan throughout this war, Jordan's own air defense systems, working alongside American forces stationed in the country, have had to intercept enormous numbers of projectiles throughout this conflict. 108 projectiles intercepted in the opening days alone, followed by 85 additional missiles and drones launched toward Jordan during the second week of fighting, with the Royal Jordanian Air Force successfully intercepting 79 of those, though 5 drones and 1 missile still managed to land inside Jordanian territory despite those defensive efforts. And in Kuwait, according to a detailed account of strikes there, debris specifically from intercepted Iranian drones put 6 separate power lines out of service, according to Kuwait's own electricity ministry, illustrating that even successfully intercepted attacks still generate real, tangible damage and disruption for the countries caught in the crossfire of this broader conflict. So let's step back and put this entire, genuinely fascinating story together into one coherent picture. Iran entered this year's war with an air defense network already meaningfully weakened by an earlier Israeli campaign back in October of 2024, one that had already destroyed most of its long-range detection radars and advanced S-300 batteries. That existing vulnerability was then compounded by years of patient, methodical intelligence preparation, with Israeli and American forces specifically using training exercises involving Greece's own identical S-300 systems to learn exactly how to detect, track, and neutralize this exact category of Russian-supplied technology. When this current war actually began in late February, the years of preparation paid off almost immediately, with Israel achieving meaningful aerial superiority within just 24 hours, enabling large-scale strikes across Tehran and other areas with dramatically reduced risk to Israeli pilots. Over the following months, that initial success expanded into the near-total destruction of Iran's mobile missile systems, with roughly 92% destroyed according to Israeli assessments, alongside American claims of having destroyed approximately 90% of Iran's actual weapons manufacturing capacity. And in response to losing this centralized, radar-dependent defensive capability, Iran appears to have accelerated its own pivot toward a completely different kind of threat: cheap, portable, decentralized weapon systems that don't rely on the exact same vulnerable technology that made its previous air defense network so susceptible to years of carefully prepared Israeli and American countermeasures. This is exactly the kind of story that deserves genuine appreciation for just how sophisticated and how patient modern military intelligence work can actually be, well beyond just the dramatic footage of explosions and missile strikes that typically dominate coverage of this war. The actual weapon that took down Iran's air defenses wasn't a single missile or a single aircraft. It was years of quiet, methodical study, using a completely unrelated country's military hardware as an unwitting practice ground, to build exactly the kind of technical knowledge needed to blind and dismantle one of Iran's most significant strategic assets the moment war actually began. I want to know what you think about all of this. Do you think Iran's shift toward cheaper, more decentralized weapon systems represents a genuinely effective long-term countermeasure to this kind of sophisticated air defense suppression campaign? Or do you think Israel and its allies will simply adapt their own approach again to counter this new threat the same way they methodically defeated the previous one? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I read every single one of them, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I want happening on this channel. And if this video helped you understand just how much patient behind-the-scenes intelligence work actually goes into a military campaign like this one, share it with someone who's been following this war but hasn't heard about the fascinating years-long story behind how Iran's air defenses actually collapsed. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you in the next video as we keep tracking exactly how the story continues to unfold.